Hello. I am Michael Chidester. I think a lot of you guys know me. If you don't, I've been doing this for a while. For about 13 years, I've been doing a project called Hour. And you should check it out. It's pretty cool. Today, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about Meyer. About the book that he published in 1570 and a couple things he wrote before that. And then the meat of this is going to be about something called the Meyer Census that we were working on before the pandemic and tried to continue on through the pandemic, which is mostly about trying to understand what happened to Meyer's book after it was published. And go through some cool stuff that we found in the process of doing that. I might throw in some funny quotes at the end, and we'll come to a conclusion and take questions. If you have questions during this presentation, feel free to just raise a hand, shout it out. I'm happy to be disrupted so you can get more information if I'm not clear about something. And if you save your questions till the end, forget them, that doesn't help anybody. So, on to this guy. Maybe. How many of you here know who Joachim Meyer is? Let's see some hands. Yeah. How many of you have actually read anything he wrote? Yeah. Almost as many hands. That's good. That's very encouraging.
Not his entire lexicon.
I have no idea if this is actually Joachim Meyer or not. This is a picture of a dude from his book who's got kind of a messed up face and a funny beard. And I like to think that that's Meyer. Here he is again, doing a kung fu pose. And you'll notice these two pictures don't quite look the same. The one on my left, your right, is printed. This one comes from one of his manuscripts. Have you ever wondered why, in 1570, 100 years after printing was invented, Joachim Meyer was creating manuscripts? Anyone ever had that question?
100 years after.
The answer is because printing is a terrible way to make a single copy of a book. Printing was invented as a way to speed up book production. To try and be like a mechanical scribe that can make books faster, but the problem is making one book on a printing press takes weeks and weeks and weeks. It takes as long as it does to make it with a scribe. The benefit is you can make 100 books as fast as a scribe can make one book. But if you only want one book in this time period, it did not make sense to try and have it printed. So when Joachim Meyer was creating books for specific clients, he created manuscripts. And when he was trying to create a book that could be distributed widely, that's when he turned to printing. And you see this a lot. The manuscript didn't die until long after this period, because if all you wanted was one copy, having a person handwrite it was usually faster and cheaper than having it printed. Very quickly, he wrote a couple of manuscripts that we know of. One is called the Lund. It covers the two-handed sword, the Dusak, and the rapier, as well as having some funky cutting diagrams. And you guys over here probably can't see what I'm doing. So if you guys if I'm getting in the way, feel free to move around to that side. There's still some chairs. I'm mostly going to be standing right in this area where there's a whole gaggle of people. I'm sorry. So, we've also, as of last year, heard about a second manuscript, which we knew existed, but we thought that it would disappear forever. And then it resurfaced in, shockingly, exactly the same museum that we thought it was in the first place. There's a whole story there. But, yeah, it turns out they had it all along and it wasn't lost. It's in Munich at the Bavarian National Museum. It likewise covers the two-handed sword, Dusak, rapier, but also adds in dagger, pole arms, and fighting in armor. And then the third manuscript by Meyer is in the city of Rostock at the University Library. This one is mostly not his writing, but he added some notes at the end on rapier fencing. But we're not here to talk about any of that stuff. That's boring, right? What we care about is what we call the 1570, which is this book. Basic Stats was printed by Thibault Berger in 1570. There was a second edition in 1600 after Meyer died. The book is about 9 by 7 inches, although different books are different sizes, different copies, and we'll go over that in a minute. The paper is not a uniform thickness throughout. Some pages are much thicker than others. It has 228 leaves, which is 456 pages that I'll be counting now, which is a hefty little book. It's divided into 3 sections for some reason. The page numbers start over twice during the course of the book. We don't know why it's done that way. But possibly the idea at first was going to be to print it as 3 volumes, and then eventually it got compressed together into 1. And there are 62 woodblock prints attributed to Tobias Stimmer, although most likely he had nothing to do with it. And it was his brother, Hans Christoffel Stimmer, who actually did most of the work, and his apprentices. And anyways, enough about that, because we're not here to talk about the book either, but rather the books.
Oh.
Here are the front pages of 20 different copies of the 1570. These are the first 20 that I have pictures of. I've actually got like twice as many now. And I'll tell you why I did that in a minute. But you can see right away, these do not all look the same. This is the exact same book in 20 different printed copies from the same printing press at the same time. But the years have been kinder to some than others. Some are painted, some are not. Some are more faded than others. Some have water damage, some have writing on them. These books have all had their own separate lives since 1570. Let's start in 2019. A woman named Sarah Barsness, who's a member of the Meyer Prefecture Guild and lives in, I believe, Wisconsin, created a list of copies of Meyer. She went to Meyer Symposium and heard someone say, no, we don't actually know how many copies of this book were printed or how many even survive now. And she said, wait, I'm a librarian. I know how to read library catalogs. So she started trying to answer that question. And she found 38 copies of Meyer's book, which she posted on Facebook, as one does. And other people got excited and started looking for more, including me. Our main sources were, if you're interested, WorldCat, a site called Meyer, a service called the Universal Short Title Catalog, which tries to catalog all early books that were printed, and various national catalogs. And then some of us were just like, wait, I saw a copy of this book at this library, it's not on your list. And so personal experience also played into it. Many people in the Meyer community had seen a copy of Meyer's book at some point, but it's certainly not all of them. At this point, we know of 67 copies of Meyer's book that exist. 37 1570s, 30 1600s, and then also there's 3 manuscripts on top of those to make a nice round 70 for now. And they're currently in 14 countries. Here is a quick bird's eye view of where all these copies currently live. You'll notice there are quite a few in the United States. You may also, what you probably didn't notice is that to make this all fit, I had to leave Greenland in the middle there. The Atlantic Ocean is actually much wider than this, but trying to fit Europe and America on the same map is tricky.
Greenland is false.
Yeah, so it's kind of missing there.
Are there any copies in Greenland?
That's why it doesn't matter, right?
They are, but they're fictional.
It's actually a much longer boat ride from Ireland over to Canada here. But yeah, if you guys are ever interested, there are copies of Meyer in Worcester, Massachusetts. There are 3 or 4 in New York City. There's a couple in Washington, D.C. And there's one down at UT Austin in Texas for some reason.
Are
So if you're ever in one of these cities,
Are those both public and private collections?
yeah. So the New York Public Library has a copy, for example. There's 2 in the Metropolitan Museum. I think there's other ones in New York. There's one in the Folger Shakespeare Library, which is the least accessible in the United States. There's also one in the Library of Congress, which any American citizen can go in and request if they really feel like it. And then there's also 2 people in the U.S. have copies of certain, or have certain pages from original copies. Chris Van Slambrook in Madison, Wisconsin, and Christoph Amberger, who lives somewhere in Maryland, both managed to acquire pages that had been cut out of copies of the book
On eBay.
in the past. Yeah, Chris was on eBay. He was found in Meyer. And didn't pay nearly as much as you might think for that page, which is not very much as well. But anyways, these are all the copies that we know of. If any of you ever come across a copy that's on this list, we would love to hear about it. And like I said, there's one in the New York Public Library, and there are several in universities. So there could be one near where you live, if you haven't ever looked. That was the call we put out in 2019, was for everybody in Lima to go poke through local libraries, especially libraries like at universities that have special collections. Because what happens is rich guys buy books, and then they die, and their books go to their university. And so over time, the collection just grows and gets strange stuff in them. So you never know where the next one will pop up. However, most are indeed in Europe. So what I did at that point, I took charge of part of this, and I started sending Lima clubs into these libraries to look at them. Because what I wanted to know is, what's in these books? And I'll tell you what I hope to find at the very end of this. Because, spoiler, we didn't find it yet. We're still looking. So, it was really easy to get Americans on board, because I know lots of Americans. We also started getting Europeans to go into some of those libraries, and then the COVID came.
Oh.
Because, by the way, 2019 was right before everything fell apart. But, undaunted, that's when we started getting scans. So we started paying to have every copy of this book scanned that we could get for a reasonable price, which in this case was a few $100 or less. And we ended up with an astonishing number of these scans. I have, I think, somewhere 20-something copies of 1570 and about 20 copies of 1600 now, mostly paid for with Wiktenauer money, running 2016 fundraiser. And also, most of these are now online for free. So because we went through this whole process, if you guys are ever interested, you can go to the Wiktenauer page on Meyer and find links to about 20 different copies of this book that the libraries, once we pay for the scans, we're happy to give away for free to everybody else. That's how the scanning process works. One person pays, and they're like, hey, we have these free scans. We may as well put them on the internet, which is good for everybody. Really.
Our copies.
What did we learn? First of all, we learned that there were errors in the book that got corrected in the middle of printing. Things like this wrong page number. You might not be able to see this, but this says XCXIX for page 99. What that actually is 9019, if you're rusty on your own numerals. And then they helpfully fixed it to 9018. Because this is in fact page 98. There's also this strange case of this illustration, figure D, which again, I know there's not enough resolution here, but if you ever look at this, in between the legs of these two guys standing in guard are some tiny numbers. This is number 11 and number 7. And these guys have a letter D above their arms. This is the only figure that's labeled. And these are the 7th and 11th guards in his list of guards. I don't know what the D is exactly. But there's also these two rectangles that were left in. And perhaps the idea was they would be carved out into additional labels for these two positions. But that never happened. And during the printing, someone noticed it and said, oh, that's got to be a mistake. And they carved them off of the block. So about half the copies, there are these black boxes and about half the time. This is not very, very significant. Printers would often try to fix errors they noticed while they were printing, but it's interesting. We also found out that a lot of books got resized. This is about the shape of the page in the original printing. This is the copy in Munich. No, it's not. That's the copy in Berlin. This is mislabeled. But this is the correct page size. And this over here is bare. I tried to adjust to be the exact same zoom level. So you can see that like an inch was cut off of the bottom and the outer edge of this copy. And a lot of the copies have been shrunk down. Because what happens is rich collectors, especially in earlier time periods, cared a lot about having all their books match. And so they would frequently have books cut down and resized so that they can have a whole shelf of books that are the same size. This is part of the binding process. Other times they might want a book that's just more portable, so they would cut off all this extra space that didn't have anything in it. But there are definitely places where the cutting is so aggressive that it even cuts off parts of the text because they want the book to be smaller. And that was just the thing that happened. We've had a lot of different kinds of bindings. Nowadays, you buy a book and it already comes with its cover intact. In 1570, when you bought a book, what you were buying was the actual paper by itself, and then you would have it delivered to your bookbinder of choice, who would put whatever binding on it you're willing to pay for, or one that will match the rest of your books. It was very uncommon for a printer to actually have the books pre-bound. And when it happened, it was because the printer had a backdoor deal with a particular bookbinder. So the printer was still not doing it, but they would just deliver all the pages to the bookbinder who would take care of it. So here we have one. This is kind of a pretty typical Meyer cover. It's got these designs that are pressed into the leather. They would use metal tools for that, usually wheels. You would roll across the surface of the leather to make these imprints. There's also, you might be able to make out a picture of a woman in the middle here. That's actually a picture of, is that Lucretia? Yes, that is, I think that's Lucretia. So the common motif for a lot of these is there's a blind justice, a woman with a sword and holding scales, and then a Lucretia on the left, which is hard to see here, who is stabbing herself in the chest with a dagger, because that's a Roman myth. And she is often used to represent chastity, so we have justice and chastity. Like the one I just showed you, there's one on the front and one on the back. This one in Lund has both in the front and on the back. There are usually two clasps on the end. There's no point in putting clasps on paper books, but it did it for a long time. Clasps usually were devised for parchment books, because parchment will tend to get wavy if you don't keep it compressed, because it's basically a weird kind of leather that's much more brittle and less flexible if it dries out than regular leather than we're used to. But what they would say is that the parchment will try to return to the shape of the animal that it came from. What that means is it would start to get very curvy, and if you leave a parchment book unpressed for a long time, you can no longer close it. So they would clasp it closed to keep the parchment flat. And the practice of applying clasps continued for centuries after parchment books were falling out of disuse, because it also has the side effect of making a book really kind of a much more solid object that's not going to open by accident. There's usually two clasps on the end. Occasionally, as in this one, there would also be top and bottom clasps. You can see the nails where the clasps used to be on all four sides, although this one has lost that. It also had metal corner pieces that were protecting the edges of the book, which are now gone. I did up a copy of the Meyer facsimile with the similar furniture, like how it would look originally, that I'll have at my table tomorrow. You can look at and examine. Here's another one. This one had leather ties on the side that you would tie the book closed instead of clasping it. It also has had some asshole's coat of arms stamped over the original design. So the original design had another one of the blind justices here, but some king of Bavaria had the Bavarian arms stamped over it in gold, so you can't see the original part anymore. This is at the Bavarian State Library in Munich. There's also a cheap copy. This one is bound in parchment, and you can see someone had their coat of arms painted on it. This is a much more modest binding, which would be just as durable as leather, but much cheaper to make. Anyways, enough of bindings. I assume you've all seen some of Meyer's figures, the pretty illustrations. Yes?
Question. Back to bindings for a moment there. Have you gone through and taken a census and cataloged the different binders, or just any differences?
For the most part, I haven't been able to determine who the binder was, but we have cataloged all the different bindings that we found.
Okay, would that be from the different inset, the pressings on it, the designs? Can you safely assume that those would be different binders, or would that have been just kind of a standardized design?
So the tools that were used to put the impression on these leather covers were fairly widely available. that he made by Smiths and distributed to bookbinders. So that none of them are very unique.
Okay.
Usually you would look for a binder's mark in there somewhere. And as far as I can tell, at least from scans, most of these don't have a binder's mark that's visible. In some cases, in a few cases, it does indicate who the binder is written inside the cover, but in a lot of cases it doesn't. Even the Lucretia and Justice stamps, which were less common, were used pretty widely in the part of Germany that Meyer lived in this time period. You see a lot of books that have those stamps. It was a popular thing to put on books in like the late 16th century. So I haven't found anything that is 100% suggestive of whether any of these books were bound by the same binder, which is the big question I had. They might have been, they might not have been. I don't know. Someone with more specialization would have to look at it to answer that question better than me at this point. Anyways, so this is a figure from Meyer's book, which was restored by Heidi Zimmerman as part of a crowdfunding campaign a while back. This is how we're used to looking at Meyer's prints, right, on the internet, except not quite anymore because Lichtenauer no longer has these, but once upon a time, what it actually looks like in the book is more like this. You can see liquid stains. The book is not quite centered on the page. Parts of it are worn out. This is what an actual copy of Meyer looks like. It's not quite as pretty as all that. And even though we usually try to make the pictures in our fencing manuals as pretty as possible when we present them, in the actual books, they're often a little bit less immaculate. However, a lot of people, upon receiving these books, were going to change that. So what they would do is they would fancy them up. Now, even though most of these books in this time period were printed with black and white pictures because color printing was very unreliable and very difficult and very uncommon because you had to basically make, like you would print this by taking a block of wood that had the design carved into it, you'd put ink on it and stamp it on a page. If you wanted a color picture, you'd have to make several different blocks where just the specific colors were carved onto that and then line it up perfectly and stamp it on the page, and it never actually lined up perfectly. So color printing was a thing they knew how to do, and it kind of sucked, and no one really wanted to do it. Like the level of work involved was not worth the outcome. What you would do instead is you would take your book to what was called a briefmaler, who was a card painter, and you would ask to have the pictures painted. Because medieval books were not finished until they had all their illustrations painted, and that idea persists into printing. So if you could afford it, you would have painting applied to your book, and thereupon you would have proper pictures, and not just the crappy black and white ones. There are 8 copies of Meyer now, we now know, at least, that have this painting. This was the second one that was discovered. It's in Leipzig. And this one made a huge splash on the HEMA internet when it was first noticed by HEMA people. And it turns out, even though we've now found 6 more copies, this is still the prettiest one. So this is the only one that has every single picture painted, and the color is very elaborate and very expensive. Here's another painted one. This one's in Rostock, and you can see, for some reason, the painting process stopped partway through. So only certain colors have been applied, and other things just never actually got painted because you would typically go one color at a time. So this is funny because it's half painted. Here's an even crappier one. This looks like someone just splashed cut finger paint on it, kind of.
It looks like someone started finger painting.
This is the copy in Nuremberg, I believe. No, my note says Coburg. Nuremberg is also crappy, but differently bad.
It looks like you try to use like watercolors.
Like this looks like it's no longer being done by a professional painter at all, but possibly a child got to it with their paints at some point. It's hard to say. And then of course the copy in Leuven is not painted, but somebody added blood splatter to all of it. So, and also a few of the dagger pictures have blood splatter. Anytime you thought that there might be bug contact, you get a Kurosawa blood fountain. That one's pretty good. That's in the Corbel collection. So people obviously really liked these pictures. If they were going to go to great extent to paint them, We also find that evidence because several copies have actual indexes of the illustrations written into the book. So people would go through and carefully document them all so they could flip just through the pictures and not have to find them. On the side there, you can also see that the copy in Leipzig has small tabs on the pages showing the location of each picture. So again, presumably, if you want to show your friends the cool fencing book you got, you can just flip right to the cool pages and not worry about all the boring words. This one is in a copy of the 1600 in Munich, and that's 1570 in Leipzig. People also decorated the books themselves with various doodles and artwork. This is a copy that is in, no notes, okay. This is a copy that is, I believe it's in Vienna. Oh, I have it at the top there. Where someone put this frame on here, they probably used to have a picture in it, but the picture's gone. But they did a pencil frame around it. And then on this page, and inside the cover, they carefully copied this print, which only one copy that I know of exists in the National Library of France. But someone carefully copied the pencil into the cover of their book. That's a nice decoration.
A little extra.
No idea who made this print. The library doesn't know. They say it's the cover of a fencing manual, which seems preposterous to me because fencing manuals don't have covers like this. But they totally have no idea. But this has the iconic griffin facing off against the lion of St. Mark, representing the Freifechter von der Feder and the Brotherhood of St. Mark, as the two 17th century fencing guilds that were kind of competing with each other in the Roman Empire. And also musicians, who are pretty common in infectious scenes. So, people would also add other smaller doodles. This copy in New York City, someone carefully copied down this leg in the lower margin. And I'm not sure what that one is, but the blob at the top kind of looks like a face wearing a hat, and then a triangular body at the copy in Washington, D.C. at the Folger Library. So, writing in margins was fairly common in books in this time period. It was a way of studying. We still do that. People often are recommended that when they're studying. There are several copies where the illustrations have labels, especially in the sword section. In this case, the guards are labeled in two different copies, Bamberg and Meyer. I don't think that this was part of that, but this is a beautiful spear. In the Munich 1600, Zornhut is labeled inside the Dusak, and in the Metz copy, all the rapier guards, or 3 of the 4 rapier guards, are labeled in the middle of the print. So here, this guy is an iron gate, and this says Eisenpforte. And the other thing that we see pretty commonly is the errata being implemented in the text. So once the printing was done, a bunch of errors were identified and were printed on the last page with the corrections. That's what all this is. But several times people went through their copies and they made all the changes to fix the mistakes. And in this copy, somebody in Coburg's, once they were all fixed, the guy scribbled out all the errata to show that it was no longer. And that's what that is. A couple other random things. There's a copy that's in that's in Augsburg, which might have been signed by Dr. Meyer. What this says is that it was made in the shop of Joachim Meyer, Freifechter of Strasbourg, which we know is not true. But the handwriting here, because he wasn't a printer, but the handwriting here is pretty close to handwriting that we have from Meyer. So it's possible that he wrote that in this book himself. The only one that I know of that might have had Meyer's writing in it. There's also a copy in Göttingen with the same label, but on a printed piece of paper that's glued into the book, covering up this printer's mark from Thibault Berger. It says printed in the shop of Joachim Meyer, Freifechter, or this Freifechtersburg. Anyways, Joachim Meyer of the Freifechters, citizen of Strasbourg. And I think we're coming to the end of this part, but there's a master who published in 1579 named Heinrich von Bunderoth, who actually had some slightly unkind things to say about Meyer, but somebody apparently studied his book and then copied parts of it inside their copy of Meyer, including over there putting the Latin terms for all of the weapons inside their book that comes from Heinrich von Gunderot's work. So even though he didn't like Meyer, somebody else who read his book did. And we also discovered in a copy of Meyer that's in Czech Republic this completely different fencing. It's a very small treatise that describes an otherwise unknown fencing style about circle fencing or Oktoberfecht. It's a single large, like 9 by 12 sheet that's folded up and glued into the book that might be related to a friend of Heinrich von Gunderot named Balthasar Harmonio Pomerano, or BCP at the bottom there. And the teachings are similar to Gunderot, but at the time we found this, we had never heard of any of this. I've since found 2 more copies of this in other books, but this single sheet seemed to be distributed as his teachings, and they ended up in a copy of Meyer. They go along with this interesting diagram, which has triangles and circles, and also the Gewunderstieg diagram, which is mentioned in this text. But this picture, this is from a Gunderot manuscript, and was not part of that other document. And finally, there's a copy in Augsburg that has a ton of notes that seem to be discussing Italian fencing and possibly comparing it to Meyer, but these are so damaged at this point that they really can't be read anymore. Most of the words are just disintegrated off the page. I had the library try to scan it in different lighting conditions and at much higher resolution, and a lot of these words are just completely gone, or so smeared over time that they just are not sensible anymore. But the parts that we can read are kind of interesting. However, it's only the inside of each cover that has these notes, not the whole book, sadly. We also have other interesting marginal notation. This is a copy of the 1600 where someone repeated Meyer's cutting lines in the margin and then put numbers between the lines telling which line was described by which part of the paragraph. And here's the terrible to remember copy I mentioned before, which is the bottom, someone wrote Hoc Fecit, which means I made this. They might have written it again here, but like in finger paint. It's something. Very proud, clearly, of this fake job. This copy also has some terrible underlining that kind of like blocks the text that's being underlined. And it's very much water damaged. But it also has these tantalizing notes over here, which seem to be referencing a different book. And no book that I've checked, like no fencing manual, lines up with this. But for every single one, it has that letter J, and then it gives a page number and which side of the page the reference is on. And I have no idea what this could be. It goes through like several pages of this with these notes. And yeah, there's no indication of what book is actually being noted there, but it's kind of tantalizing. So, this is the stuff that we found so far, which is kind of interesting. What I was hoping to find is the elusive student. For example, this is a copy of Nicoletto Giganti's book, which on most of the pages has these long paragraphs in the margin offering commentary on Giganti's teachings from somebody who was clearly very familiar with fencing. Or here's a copy of Hans Wilhelm Schoeffer's enormous 900-something page rapier treatise from 1620. And again, some student very carefully annotated a lot of his book. And there's actually 2 different copies of his book that have the same annotations in it. As well as in this copy, which I believe is in Göttingen, they added like 100 manuscript pages in between the 2 halves of his book. They just added a whole bunch more pages into the binding. So certainly the practice of writing long commentary in books was fairly common in this time period. And what I wanted to find by looking through all these books was a copy of Meyer that had this level of attention in terms of marginal notes, because if we could find out what people in the 16th or 17th century thought about Meyer's teachings, we would know a whole lot more about fencing in this time period. And for a brief moment, I thought I had found it. This is a copy that's in Berlin. It's the 1600. It had a bunch of pages cut out of it with illustrations, which was a pretty common practice during a certain time period by evil people who would, book dealers who would decide they could sell each individual picture for more than the book itself would go for, like collectively. Like if I cut out 70 pictures, each one of those is worth more than 1/70th of this book. And so they would cut out the picture, throw away the book, and sell the pages individually. But in this book, somebody took it and they actually hand-traced pictures to replace the ones they were missing. And they also copied down the text on the back of those illustrated pages back into the book. This person also extensively underlined things and offered commentary in between them, like doing things like checking Meyer's math and saying, wait, he said there was 12 things, but there's only 11 here. Drawing little diagrams to try to make sense of what was going on, offering cross-references to other sections, very seriously studying the text. But unfortunately, what I found out in the end was this was the great Karl Lassmannsdorff who was doing this, who maybe you guys haven't heard of, was a 19th century sport historian who was very, very interested in the history of fencing. And he wrote several books on historical wrestling long before HEMA ever started. But he owned this book and he studied it, and not somebody in Meyer's own time period, sadly. Which makes it still really cool, but more of a HEMA thing and less of a, or more of a historical study thing and less of a contemporary to the actual thing happening. Unfortunately, but still a whole lot of cool notes. And this copy is online, so you can find it and page through it yourself and see all of his thoughts, if you can read it. Further research, there are 8 libraries that we've not been able to get in touch with and find out about their books. What we also did, after the pandemic started, we started reaching out to libraries and asking if they wouldn't scan the book, could they... Sorry, James, am I interrupting your class? No. This man is teaching the next class, and you should go to his class when I'm done here. Yeah. Which is starting at 8 o'clock in 20 minutes. I just thought I'd check. I was afraid I was going long. So we asked librarians to go in and pull out their copies and actually page through them for us and give us notes on what they find. And in some cases, they also took pictures and sent us those. So in addition to all the scans we had a whole bunch of librarians who were happy to go in and actually do this legwork for us and find interesting things. And these libraries you might still get information from and have more knowledge. Here are the questions that we still have not answered. How many books were initially printed? We don't know. Estimates range from 200 to 1,200 original copies. How many copies still exist? What is in the books we haven't found yet? Obviously, we don't know that. What can we learn about who owned these books before their current owners? What happened to these books as they passed through the last 500 years? And what can we learn about that? And what can we learn about from the use marks, like the fingerprints and the underlining and so on, that tells us how these books are being valued? These are the questions that I had when we were starting out, and I've answered them a little bit, but we still have a whole lot more to learn about all of these things. But anyways, I would like to thank all of these people who helped us out with finding this information. You may know some of these names. These people are all wonderful. A lot of them are HEMA people. Some of them are especially European librarians and collectors who managed to give us information. And before I finish and take more questions, I told you I would give you some funny quotes. So Heinrich von Luther, as I mentioned, all he says he only mentions one master, and it's Meyer, and he says, a few years ago, a certain man from Strasbourg, known as Joachim Meyer, tried to show certain rules and even published a big volume in the German language. Although he seemed to have understood a little bit, he did not make clear the practical use of the fundamentals. Thank you, Heinrich von Luther, about Joachim Meyer. However, for all of that, he totally copied some of Meyer's illustrations. He didn't see any value in this book. There are a few Italian masters that actually seem to think Meyer was okay. He's described as scaled by Giuseppe Morsica de Pallavicini. in his book where he's listing all of the important masters that he knew of in history. Likewise, Marcelli in 1686 mentions Gioacchino Mainero. However, the funniest of all, of course, it comes from this dude, Luis Pacheco de Galvez, who was a Spanish fencing master in the 17th century, and really the Spanish fencing master in the 17th century, especially in his own opinion. He was a student of Carranza, who founded the school of Verdadera Destreza, but Pacheco was really the one who institutionalized it and turned it into the Spanish fencing by getting in with the royal family and thereby imposing his will on the entire country. He wrote a book called Nueva Ciencia y Filosofía de la Destreza de las Armas. The manuscript was written in 1629, but it wasn't published until after his death in 1670. What was that last thing I said? Oh, and also a book called Engaño y Desengaño, which means something like illusion, disillusion. But in Nueva Ciencia, he lists everybody who he's going to badmouth at the beginning, which you can see is quite a list. Oh yeah, no, he doesn't like anybody except for Carranza, and only Carranza a little bit. So he has this great thing where he says, this is an example of this entire 500-page book, how he writes. We find 8 authors to be the first seminarians of this sect, a disfigured and horrendous monster who might have venerated. The 5 Italians who are Pietro Monte, Achilles Barozzo, Camillo Agrippa, Giacomo di Grassi, Giovanni della Gocchie. From Mallorca was Jaime Ponce de Perpignan, and Spaniards Francisco Roman and Pedro de la Torre. Another great mob of authors followed these, on the whole, despite contradicting them in part, whose superfluous writings squandered the world like letters to their vanity. And then these were Joachim Meyer, and then he gives a whole list after Joachim Meyer. So in this book, in Nueva Ciencia, Meyer is the first of the mob of authors who follow the 8 terrible authors. However, in Engaño y Desengaño in 1635, he gets promoted, and now there are 9 authors who are the first seminarians, and Meyer is inserted right here between the Italians and the guy from Mallorca. He also, was there a question? Yeah.
They're supposed to be ranked in order of
Who can say really? But he seems to go by nationality. So Meyer might have been the worst one or the least bad. Who knows, really? With Pacheco, there's all kinds of ways you can interpret it. He does correctly note that Meyer was published in 1570. I forgot to mention that both of the Italian authors before got the year wrong, which makes you wonder how well they knew about his book. But he at least had read the title page and seen a year on it. He also says, here's an example of how he talks about people, and this same prize is owed to Joachim Meyer for having translated into the German language for the teaching of his nation such humble thoughts without reason or foundation that he became fond of and satisfied by. To Pacheco, all authors on fencing were merely translating true art to the best of their ability. So when he says translated, I don't think he means from one language to another, although sometimes he seems to be implying that Meyer was just an inferior copy of Barozzo. But I think what he means is trying to express that it's Destreza, which only Pacheco understands, to the best of his ability. Yes?
Okay, so the word you use for German is different than like the modern Spanish word for German. So is this like an earlier dialogue?
Yeah, so Chidester and Tedesco in Italian is a different word. It doesn't quite mean German. Well, so the word German is really tricky because like every single European language has a different word for Germans, right? Because sometimes they're Alemán or Aleman, sometimes they're Tedesco. German was actually what the Romans called them, not what they called themselves, so it comes from Latin. But the English especially seized on German. None of them are actually what like Deutsch, which is the modern German word for German, or any of the historical ones. But Chidester and Chidester, I think, were especially used to describe German immigrants into Mediterranean countries. So it wasn't the Germans in Germany, but it was the Germans who come to our land, like Germans in Italy and Spain. But also it is just a more general term for everybody who was from Northern Europe, like north of the mountains and so on. It is weird that Pacheco uses this. I don't usually see it in Spanish texts, but it is a recognized kind of one of the versions of the name for Germans. He also describes a rapier dagger play, which leads me to believe, well, so I gave this presentation at Brescia at a conference last year, and Manuel Valle, who's one of the leading experts on destreza, goes up to me afterwards. He's like, Pacheco didn't know German, so how the hell did he read Meyer? Or, he didn't say how the hell because he's very dignified. But that was basically his question. And so either Pacheco hired somebody to translate for him, which could have happened because he was a posh, rich aristocrat, or all he did was page through the book and look at the pictures and be like, this is bullshit. He doesn't say anything that would require you to know what the words on the page mean. Like at one point, he has a quote that I didn't put in here, where he's like, Meyer spent 60 pages and 12 illustrations teaching bullshit about the two-handed sword. And it's like, okay, so he counted the pages, but he didn't actually express what's in them. He just dismissed it as being wrong. So we don't know that he actually read anything. Yes?
Is it possible, so just what words you couldn't cast?
He, I believe, was hereditary nobility. He might have been like one of the ones who fought his way up to nobility in his lifetime, but I think he was born that way.
So, in correlation to these other knights, is it possible that this is a similar concept that you see with Fiore, where it's like gives out the peasant's hands and then he looks at these people as lesser?
Oh, I bet it totally, that's at least part of it. Yeah, like this guy was totally conceited about everything, not only that Spain was great, but also that he personally was great. And I certainly get the sense from him that there was a whole lot of class sentiment as well, because he was the fencing master to the king. And all these, like the term that he has for non-destreza is either common fencing or vulgar fencing. And there's a lot of language that he uses that is kind of talking down to the common man. And that you can become elite if you master his teachings, but if you don't know his teachings, there's no way you're an elite fencer. And really, only the people who are of his same class deserve to have the privilege of being fencing masters and so on. I would not be surprised at all if the more I read in this, the more that class sentiment comes out. But from the little I've read, it definitely seems to be present. And that is the end. So questions have already started, but please give me more questions.